bats and mice, I mean, they're having massive amount of potentially massive amount of offspring every few months. They can have a whole litter of more offspring. So bats are not like that. They're having one pup one time a year, if that, and usually they're having one pup a year. And then some species actually tend to have twins. So there's some that will have twins, and that's a lot. Once in a rare while, you might see a triplet, but that's pretty challenging because the mom really only has 2 teats, and so feeding three hungry babies is probably one of them is not going to do so well. But yeah, so this is another reason when we get later to thinking about conservation, why it's so important. They aren't going to repopulate themselves super quickly. If we lose an entire colony, it's not like they can just exponentially regrow that colony. So the other really cool thing about bats that people know, but a lot of people don't really understand it, is that they have sonar. Bats are not blind. So this is a huge misconception. People think they're blind. They are absolutely not blind. Even bats that only fly at night, that are only out in the dark, in the forest, they can still see. But it is dark, and they're navigating around trees. They're trying to find prey. And so they have this cool adaptation, which we call echolocation, which they're using to navigate. And so basically they're doing like a bird would chirp. So they're yelling out of their mouth, yell, 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 yell. And then they're waiting for the echo to come back, bounce off and come back. And that's telling them where the objects are in front of them. So if they know how to fly around a tree because they hear the echo bouncing back, oh, the echo bounced back in front of me, but it didn't bounce back on the side. So I need to go around this way because that way is clear of trees. And that's how they find their prey. So they can see. If it's light out, they can certainly use their eyes to navigate around. But this echolocation method is so efficient for them. So that's a great tool that they have that allows them to be this great predator of night critters out there. So I have a one more little graphic on that. So you can see this little bat is calling out, and the sound goes out, and then it reflects off the moth, and it comes back to him, and then he can hear the signal, and he knows exactly where the moth is. And while bat biologists specifically use this in order to track bats and study bats. So this little square is a printout from what we call an Anabat detector. And that's what we see when we record the sound of the bats. And so we're seeing each of those little swishes is a bat call, is a pulse. So we can see that this is just a bat probably flying through the forest. If he's zeroing in on prey, we see the little swishes get closer and closer and closer together, because as he's getting closer and closer to the prey, he's doing it faster and faster to try and narrow in on where it's at. And so they're doing this to find prey, but they're pretty much doing it the whole time that they're out flying around at night. So they're using it to navigate around. And the crazy thing is, so it's really loud. We cannot hear it because it is above the level of our hearing range. So it is a higher frequency than we hear as humans. But if we could hear it, it would be as loud as a fire alarm going off right next to your head. So I like to think about this the way we, imagine walking around the forest during the daytime and you hear birds singing, and it's not that loud, but like if there's a lot of birds, it can be kind of noisy. And imagine at night, we're not hearing any of this, but if there's bats flying around everywhere, and often there is, imagine the sounds it would be that we just don't hear them. And I think that's just such an interesting thing to think about. There's a lot of noise out there that we cannot hear because it is just a little bit above our hearing range. Couple more misconceptions that I want to touch on before I move on is there's a few long-standing unfounded fears around bats, and most of them are not true. So one is that they fly into your hair. I think probably most of us have heard this at some point, and it is just not true. Bat does not want to fly into your hair. They do not want to run into you. They have no reason to want to run into you. That would be a horrible choice on their part. I suppose if you are standing in the entrance to a cave, and you've probably seen, videos of some massive exit of bats out of a cave at sunset, and you're standing in the entryway and there's 1,000 bats flying by your head. Yeah, one of them might browse by your head, because what else, you're standing in a really bad spot. But they're not going to come around and try and get in your hair. They're not going to get tangled in your hair. Total myth. Yeah, another big one, and this is definitely something to be concerned about, so I don't want to dismiss it entirely, but there's bats are one of the species that can carry rabies, and so we do have to be very careful when we're handling them, but it's actually quite rare. And so bats will die eventually if they have rabies. So it's not like most of the population is carrying rabies. And we actually think it's probably maybe 1% of the population. And a lot of numbers will say 1/2 of 1% of bats are carrying the rabies virus. And if you look at reported numbers, it will often be higher. And I've seen numbers like 10%. And that is because those are the bats that are being tested. And so the bats that end up being tested are the ones that were found, thought maybe to be sick. So they're the ones that get brought in. And then, yes, some of them end up that they are sick. And so that is still quite a low number. And those are, again, the ones that are brought in because they're exhibiting behavior that makes them seem like they might be sick. And so this is actually a very rare disease. There's way easier ways to get sick and die than contracting rabies, especially from a bat. Certainly we don't want to be touching bats. Even when we're working with bats, as a bat biologist, we're wearing gloves. There's definitely, I know some of those photos I showed at the very beginning, people were barehanded, and we really have tried to get away from that, as far as making sure we always have gloves on. And some species are a little bit more feisty than others, and some species have a little bit stronger jaws than others. But so when you're handling them as a professional, you kind of know which ones you need the thick leather gloves with and which ones you can use just maybe some thinner cloth gloves. But as a general public, and anyone, if you absolutely need to pick up a bat for any reason, you would want to make sure you have on some really thick, heavy gloves. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we definitely want to be careful, but it's really actually very rare that a bat would have rabies. So this is kind of a myth in that it's really not that common. And this is another one that is going to be interesting to see what happens in the next several years in Florida. So we've all heard of vampire bats, and I think, obviously that's why we talk about bats a lot in October, because we're thinking about vampires and Dracula, and somehow that makes us think about bats. And however all that story started, I don't know. But vampire bats are real. There is a bat called a vampire bat. They do drink blood. The population is entirely located, for the most part, in Central and South America. So they do not live in North America. And I say that with caution because they are actually moving northward. And so they probably will end up in Florida maybe soon. However, this is a part of the myth that I'm going to dispel. They are not a threat to humans. They're not seeking humans as their source of food. They actually often prey on cattle. And what they do is they usually, and this is a chicken foot, I think, but they usually prey on cattle. And so what they do is they kind of walk up to them on the ground, and they just slice open a little tiny bit of flesh on their ankle, usually on their feet. And they have an anticoagulant in their saliva. So then the cattle bleed a little bit, and they just sit there and lap up as much as they want until they're full, and then they leave, and then they're done, and the cow's fine. So vampire bats are real, but this is not, it's not a big scary thing. And so it will be interesting. So I think they have found them in some of the Caribbean. And so, and they are projecting that they will continue moving probably northward, along with, changing habitat. So we'll need to definitely be working on some good PR on that, just because it's called a vampire bat and their food item is blood, it does not mean they're going to come after people. That is really not their target. So, forgot my map there. So now that we're looking at where bats are at, there are, and this is also something that people don't really realize, there's a lot of different species of bats. It's not just the little one and the big one. There's over 1,100 species worldwide, and bats are definitely one of those groups of animals that we're adding new species all the time, because there are so many bats. So both because we're doing more genetic testing and getting more information and deciding that maybe a bat that we had labeled as maybe one species is actually two different species. So there's a lot of that going on. However, there's also like actually finding new animals that weren't described before. We're finding new species all the time. So this number is growing. A lot of animals in rainforest and dense tropical areas. Someone's out there doing work and they're netting and they find a new species. So this number is growing, which is why it just says 1,100 plus, because we don't actually know how many there are. In the United States, we've got 48 species, which are residents across the country. And here in Florida, we have 13 species which live here year round. 2 of those 13 species are listed as federally endangered. And there's also 7 other additional species which are accidental and or occasional, who might just come through once in a while. So really we focus on those 13 species that are here year round as far as considering habitat and management. So where do bats live? So every time I do a talk on habitat and talking about where an animal lives or where they're going to be found, I always show a slide just as a reminder to everyone that every animal just needs 3 things. They need water, they need food, and they need shelter. And so also their shelter functions as where they have their social interaction. It's where they raise their pups. It's where they rest. So the shelter part is very important. The food is obviously very important. They are very high metabolic animals, so they need to eat on a regular basis. And the water is also extremely important. So that's when I worked out west and I netted thousands of bats. I don't even know the number, but thousands of different bats out west in Arizona and Wyoming. And we caught them over water. So easy there because there's no water. So if you do it before the wet season begins, everything is super dry. You go to one little cattle tank that might be 10 feet across and you got bats everywhere because they're all coming to that one little water tank to get water when they wake up to go out foraging. So those are always the things to keep in mind when we're thinking about habitat. So more specifically, even here, more specifically in Florida, and also pretty generally across the country, bats obviously will use caves. And in Florida, we have quite a few caves, but we don't have, and bats do use them, but we don't have the large colonies that are using the caves like we do up in the Northeast. So they're just different bats, and they'll use caves and they use crevices and they use rocks, but it's not like there'll be a giant colony inside. They'll just be bats miscellaneously kind of in different spots inside the cave. Trees are also a super important place for habitat, and they'll use hollow dead trees, so snags, and they'll go inside. I think I have, yeah. They'll also, so this is a very common place for bats. I know that picture is kind of small, but imagine a tree that is either dead, a snag, or dying. So pine trees will do this, and also some other hardwoods will do this, where the bark kind of starts peeling away from the bole of the tree, and it creates a nice little, inch or two space up under that bark. That's a great spot for bat habitat. They love that. So dead and dying trees are actually really, really great wildlife habitat for bats. Also in Florida in particular, they'll go into dead palm fronds. And so we don't always maybe want to cut all of the dead fronds off. And so that can provide really good habitat for some of the foliage roosting bats that like to go into tuck down into those fronds. Also, Spanish moss can be a cozy spot. This wouldn't be a place where they would spend maybe repeated nights, but it might just be a resting spot for one night or one day, sorry, during the day. And so not always a bad thing to have around. Also, a lot of the foliage roosting bats will just tuck up under the leaves if they need a spot to rest. And definitely bats will take advantage of human-made structures. So this obviously sometimes causes some conflict, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I have some slides about what you maybe should do if you end up with a bat in a structure. And the human-made structures are basically just resembling the same structure that they're finding in nature. So a bat can go into a space that's about an inch, let's say, actually even a little bit less. So these bats are not very big that live in Florida, that live in the US, really. They can go in a very small little crevice. And so we're creating those types of structures all the time. We create them under our eaves, we create them with bridges, and I think this next one's a bridge. So we think of Austin has a famous bridge. There's a lot of other places that have bridges with bats under them. And if you go under some of these bridges where the bats are living, you'll see some perfect structure that's got, just the right, like all these little slats, pieces of concrete with creating little crevices. And that's exactly what they're looking for. So we basically created this perfect habitat for them, and they're going to take advantage of it because it's a good spot. So another thing that we've started doing more and more is providing them with a house, because we've figured out the type of structure that they like. And so using bat houses and providing bat houses is a great thing to do, and they will often use the house. We cannot force them to use the house, and sometimes they do not choose to use it. So I'll talk a little bit about bat houses in a few slides. So who are the bats that we have here in Florida? This is a picture of the smallest bat in the world. It is not here in Florida. This is the Bumblebee Bat. So this is what we would call one of the Microcropdra. Basically, the Chiroptera order has two divisions. There's Microcropdra, which are most of the bats that feed on insects. Some larger ones do feed on birds, lizards, frogs, fish, not in the US, but mostly in the tropics. And then we have the Megacropdra. And so Megacropdra are the fruit bats, known as the old world fruit bats, which are also in the tropics around the world. And this is the biggest bat, also not in Florida. And so this biggest bat is impressive. Basically, if you stand with your arms out, they have a 6-foot wingspan. So basically they're the size of a 6-foot tall person with a 6-foot wingspan. And so that's impressive. And I have seen these bats. And if you've traveled in Africa, Australia, different places around Indonesia, you definitely had an opportunity to see these, and they're quite impressive. Locally, we are, if you're, I guess most of you are down in Tampa area, but if you make it up to Alachua County, we do have the Luby Bat Conservancy, and they're not open to the public, but once a year they do have the Bat Festival, which is coming up, I think it is on the 23rd. And they open up their bat barns so that you can actually visit their Megacropdra. And so they have a bunch of fruit bats there of different species. So they're different sizes. Some of them are a little smaller, but that's a good opportunity to see these guys. So what about the bats in Florida? The bats in Florida are much smaller, bigger than the Bumblebee Bat, but much smaller than the Megacropdra. So they have a wingspan of 8 to up to 15 inches, but that is those are kind of the bigger ones. Most of the bats in Florida are going to be on the smaller end of this range. So 8 to 15 inches wingspan. So, you know, we're looking at something like this, maybe. Body length, 2 to 3 inches. And that's the head to the base of the tail. The tail would be extra. And then the weight is anywhere from 6 to 40 grams. And again, the 40 grams, that is our very biggest bat. Most of our species of bats are on that smaller end, 6 to 12 grams probably for most of them. And just for reference, and you may know if you've done a lot of bird work, kind of what a gram in animal kind of feels like, but 40 grams would be still less than the weight of like a large chicken egg. So they're not very big. And I have had a table doing education at the Bat Festival for the last several years. And one of the comments I always get is people have just come out of the bat barn. They've been looking at the giant Megacropdra fruit bats, and they see my booth with, I have a few taxidermy bats, and they look at it and they say, oh, it's a baby bat. And I'm like, no, this is not a baby bat. This is a bat that lives in Florida. This is the size of our bats. They're just this big. So all the bats that you see flying around, some might be a little smaller, some might be a little bigger, but they're all kind of in this range. So here is the list of the bats that are here. I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but so this is the 13 resident species. We have the family of Vespertilionidae, and you can see I've labeled the SGCN are the species of conservation, greater conservation need, which is a FWC designation, meaning that for the most part, most of these are labeled species of conservation need, primarily because we don't have a lot of information about them, mostly because of potential habitat loss and that we don't know for sure what habitat they are using or not using. So really it's a lack of information. And I think there's only 2 on here that are not labeled as species of conservation need. And that's the evening bat, which is very common, and the velvety free-tail bat, which is only found in the Keys, and so actually very small population there. And then the plus signs are, the green plus signs are species that are known to use bat houses and human structures for roosting. So I just denoted those because a lot of questions people will ask is, you know, I have a bat house, what kind of bats might be in there? Or they'll ask, you know, there's the big bat house on the UF campus. They want to know what bats might be in there. And so these ones with the little plus are the ones that are most likely to be those that would use a structure like that. And then I have labeled the 2 that are federally endangered. That's the gray bat and then the Florida bonneted bat. And there's a lot of work going on with the Florida bonneted bat. It's also endemic only in Florida and primarily only down in southern Florida. So there's been quite a bit of research on that in the last couple of years, looking at habitat use for that species. Okay, so why are bats important? One of the biggest, most valuable things about them is they're really the only major predator of nighttime flying insects. So that's a huge benefit that we get from bats, They're out there eating insects that generally we as humans are not too fond of. Also, and this does not apply to bats in Florida because we do not have any nectar or fruit feeders, but it's really cool, so I'd like to definitely mention it, is where there are nectar and fruit feeding bats, they're a huge factor in pollinating and seed dispersal. So you see that mostly in the Southwest. You have bats that feed on cactus and pollinate different flowers. So with the exception of those few bats that are the nectar and fruit feeders, all the bats in the US are insect eaters. So that includes all the bats in Florida. So mostly the benefit that we're getting from them is definitely the eating of nighttime pests. So yeah, like I mentioned, all the bats in Florida are insectivorous. They're eating a variety of things. So they're eating mosquitoes, which we always hear about, other no-see-ums, other midges, moths, beetles. This bat has a roach in its mouth, which like I want to love all animals, but I really have struggled with roaches. So there's some cool bats in the Southwest that can eat scorpions. So, but yeah, they're eating a lot of moths and flying beetles, other flying insects at night. So they're helping us out by eating all kinds of pests. And there's been actually quite a few good studies on looking at bats eating agricultural and forest pests. And so we've documented, people have done diet studies, collected their guano, which is basically bat scat. You can collect the guano, you can see the hard pieces of insects that remain in the guano, and you can dissect that under a microscope, and you can figure out what they're eating. So we have a pretty good idea for most species, generally what their diet is. And so we know if a bat is maybe more of a moth eater or maybe more of a mosquito eater, but all of them are advantageous eaters, so they're certainly going to eat whatever they can possibly get. So one potential benefit to that is that we could think about if we have a good bat population, in theory, we have less need to use pesticides. And so this can help provide more benefit. The fewer pesticides in the environment, the more benefit. And reducing mosquito populations can also be really important just for thinking about disease transmission, which is obviously increasingly becoming an issue as we have more and more mosquito-borne illness happening. So it is true that bats can eat a lot of mosquitoes. So we have recorded information that one insectivorous bat can possibly eat up to 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in an hour. So they're basically out foraging most of the night. So they'll go out in just after sunset. They'll find some water to drink. They'll forage around for a few hours. Then they might go take what we call a nap. I mean, basically they're taking a nap. They'll go have a night roost somewhere and rest for an hour or two. And then they'll get up again and they'll go out for another maybe an hour of foraging and eat some more. And then before the sun rises, they'll go back home and then go to bed for the day. So they're out eating all night and they're eating a lot of things. So they really are providing a really good service to us, and also just acting as a modulator in the ecosystem for regulating some of these populations of insects, which have a tendency to become really large. Another benefit we can get from bats is actually using their guano. So the guano is bat poop, basically, and if does accumulate under areas where there's large roosts of bats. And so if you do have a small bat house, you will see a little bit of guano pile up eventually, but really to get large, giant mounds of guano like you see here, I mean, this is larger than an elephant. I mean, this is a huge, you can see the people standing on the sides, and that whole mound in between them is guano. And so this is, I don't know where this picture is, but it's probably a giant roost with 1 million bats in it in a cave somewhere. And so that guano pile has been growing there for, who knows how long, 50, 100 years. And so we can harvest this, and people do, and they use it for organic fertilizer. We can actually use it for gunpowder as one of the ingredients. And for the ecosystem in general, it actually is one of the important components of providing nutrients in the cave ecosystem. So it's a lot of benefits to having that guano around. So I'm on to the how can you help section. So these will just be some pointers of, thinking about the habitat that bats are using, the variety of different bats that we have, and what are some things that you can do in your own yard or on your own property that are potentially going to help provide bats and bat habitat. So one is, if you can, leave some dead trees in your yard. I mean, I certainly am not advocating for creating a fire hazard with a bunch of trees everywhere that are dying and falling over, but having one or two really good snags is really beneficial to wildlife and a lot of bird species as well. Also, if there is an old structure that's maybe not in use anymore, and there's bats using it, just let them be. Maybe they're fine to just be there. And so we can go ahead and just leave that structure there if that's possible. If there's a lot of property, a lot of land, there's no reason to necessarily get rid of that structure. In general, spraying fewer pesticides is beneficial to bats. I mean, not only are they wanting to eat the insects that we are spraying, but they're potentially ingesting some of that pesticide when they're eating those insects. And so we definitely want to be careful about spraying a lot of pesticides when we know that there's large populations of bats around. As I mentioned earlier, bats really need open water sources. So they will get a little bit of liquid energy, liquid water in their diet, but they also will drink. They basically fly down, swoop over, and drink on the fly. And they do like to have an open water source. So obviously, again, we need to balance that, especially here in Florida, with having standing water that attracts things like mosquitoes, and we don't want to create mosquito breeding grounds, but having a good open water source is really beneficial for lots of wildlife. And come back to, yes, you can build a bat house. And so that's a great thing to do. There's a lot of great plans out there, and I can share you some of those sources with those. And I'm also going to give you quite a few tips here on where you can put a bat house and where not to put a bat house. So this is definitely one of the biggest questions I often get from people is about bat houses. So I thought it'd be worth spending a little time on. But first, I think I have one more slide and on not on bat houses. And I wanted to make sure to touch on white nose syndrome. Most of you have probably heard of this, and it is a fungal infection which is killing bats all over the country, really. The good thing for us here in Florida is that at this point, it is not in Florida. So this map is the most recent map I just got today, actually off of the white nose syndrome website, which tracks locations where it's been found. And the more orangey, redder colors are the newer sightings, the newer confirmed locations. And you can see it is in northern Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana, but it is not in Florida. So hopefully it does not come here, but it very easily could. Most of the way at this point that it's been being transmitted most recently, which is how we think it got all the way out to Washington State, is by people, essentially. People are going into caves, they're traveling, they're going from cave to cave, they're not cleaning their gear, they're not cleaning their clothes, and then they get on a plane and they go somewhere else, and then they end up transferring the fungus there, and then the bats there get it. So we need to be really conscientious of that. The other advantage to maybe one of the theories as to why also we might be a little bit safer in some ways, and I won't say it's not going to come here because I'm worried that it will, but we do not have large colonies of bats roosting in caves. As I mentioned before, they will use caves, but they're not necessarily, we don't have the, thousands of bats together hibernating all at once. And so if we did have white nose syndrome that got into a cave system, it would kill some bats, but it wouldn't be the same kind of massive die-off that we've seen up in the Northeast where we're losing 1 million bats in one winter. So that's good news, but also we do need to be very careful and conscientious about what we're doing. So if you go somewhere and you go caving, especially if you go outside of Florida, clean all of your gear, disinfect it. There is disinfecting protocols that you can find on the federal white nose syndrome website. And even though we don't have it in Florida, I would advocate for doing that even when you're going caving in Florida and going from cave to cave in Florida, because if it gets in one cave, then that's the way it would spread to another cave. So a little bit about that. Okay, so in addition to bat houses, the other thing that I get a lot of questions about from random people that email me is that they have bats in some kind of structure in their house and they don't know what to do about it. And so this is a huge question right now, this time of year, because the cycle of bats in Florida is that, so they're breeding in the winter and then they have their pups in the spring, essentially. And so in the summer, they're raising their pups. And when they're raising their pups, all the females will be in what we call a maternity colony. So all the females with their pups will all stay together. So you might have some of the big colonies that you'll see, those will generally be maternity colonies. So that's females and pups. And those pups cannot fly. They cannot fly. They stay in that structure or wherever they're roosting, if they're in a cave, if they're in an old building, or if they're in a tree under some bark, that is where they stay. They stay there for months until they can fly. So mom's going out every night, she's eating, she's coming back, she's nursing them. And then about this time of year, actually, well, we're in October now, in August, they start to fly. And so at that point, you start to see a lot more bats because now all of the young, and in theory, each female has had one pup. So your population basically at that point has maybe doubled. So if you had, 10 bats in your, well, probably more than that, if it was a colony, say you had 50 females in your roof of your building and they were all going in and out every night and you didn't really notice. And now you've got 100 and half of them are not very good flyers and they're kind of awkward and they might end up on the ground because they don't know what they're doing. And so that's when people start noticing them. And so this is when we start to get calls about them. So definitely want to make sure and touch on this subject. So one of the first things I ask when someone sees a bat is like, how many did you see? So did you just see one or did you see a whole bunch? And so often if you just see one, and if they're actually, if they're outside, if they are just on your wall of your house and they're outside and one bat, I would just leave them alone. They're not probably doing anything weird. They're not doing anything wrong. They just where they ended up for the night. When they went to bed that morning, they ended up there and that's where they're probably just sleeping for the day. So generally just leave them alone. And when it gets dusk that night, they're going to fly off. Sometimes they do end up inside of a house where people are living, which is obviously a little bit of a concern if you're living in the house. And so often they've gone in there by mistake. They somehow flew in there, they didn't want to, or maybe possibly they are living in the attic and they somehow got into the interior of the home. They don't want to be in there. So just because they're inside does not mean they're sick. It just means they accidentally got in there. So they want to get out. Most likely you can open up your doors and windows, turn on the lights so everyone can see everyone, and just give them some time and space and see if they can fly out on their own. And oftentimes they will do that. If you will give them time and space and they do not leave on their own, and quite a bit of time has gone by, then definitely you may need to help them, especially if circumstances in your home are such that, you know, the kids are coming home and the dog's coming in and you need to get the bat out. So you can be very careful and, you know, wear heavy gloves. You can use a broom. Oftentimes you can put the edge, the bristly end of the broom right down or up, or if they're on the wall, up towards them, or down towards them if they're on the ground, and they'll climb onto it. And then you can carry that broom outside and lean it up against the wall. And eventually they will climb up the outside wall. They might hang out for a while and then fly away. Or you can try and scoop them into a clean trash can, an empty trash can, and then carry them outside that way. So if you need to help them getting outside, then you can do that, but oftentimes they'll get out on their own. Now, the other question is, well, what if there's many? So if there's many, and then you know there's many, you've gone out, or you've watched them come out at night, perhaps you've seen where there's an opening in your eaves, you watched them come out at sunset, you maybe saw quite a few. First of all, they might not really be causing a problem. You could have 20 bats living in your attic and they could have been there for years and you never noticed, and they're not really causing any problem. You're not going to get a massive pile of guano from a small number of bats. You're not going to contract rabies from bats being in the crawl space of your attic. Maybe they're just fine. And so oftentimes we don't actually need to do anything. But if there is a huge number and you're really adamant that you need to get them out of there, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that it is illegal in the state of Florida to do any type of exclusion during maternity season. And that is always every year from April 15th to August 15th, you cannot do any type of exclusion. And so the reason for that is what I just explained with the pups. The pups cannot fly. So if we do an exclusion, and I'll explain what that looks like in a minute, the pups cannot get out. And so what you're going to end up with is bats trapped in your attic. Two things will happen. They will either die, and then you're going to have dead, stinky animals in your attic, or they're going to try and get out of there, and they'll end up they'll figure out any crevice they can to try and get out of the attic, and they'll probably end up into the living space of your house, which is not where you want them. So we don't do exclusions during maternity season. And that said, also exclusions are really the only safe and reliable way to exclude the bats. You know, there's a slew of other things on the market out there, ultrasonic calling things and light things, and most of them don't really work. And so exclusions do work. They just have to be done outside of maternity season, and they have to be done properly. So if you're doing a bat exclusion, basically what you're doing is finding the place they're coming in and out. And the key is to seal up every single other entryway except for one. Once you have that one entryway identified and you've sealed up every other place they could possibly go in and out, then you can put something like a piece of mesh, like in this picture, over the entryway. You can also use a tube, and there's different photos of that online. And basically what happens is they fly out to go out for their evening foraging excursion. And when they come back, they can't get back in. So, because when they come out of a roost, they come out and they drop down and they fly. And so if they were to come back to this roost in the morning, there's nothing for them to grab onto that wall. They can't climb up that, and so they can't get back in. And basically you leave that up there for at least 4 nights. It needs to not be too cold, because if it's too cold, they won't be coming out anyway. And so you leave it up there for at least 4 nights when it's above 50 degrees. And then hopefully after that point, most and hopefully all of the bats have come out. And at that point, you can seal up that hole and hopefully they don't come back. So the next question that comes up then is, people often say, oh, I'm going to put up a bat house, and then the bats will all just move from my attic into the bat house, right? Well, not necessarily. So we can't force bats to move into a bat house. If we create a good bat house, they're more likely to move into it. So I just have a couple slides on what that looks like, and then I'm going to wrap up and I'll take as many questions as I can. So size is really important for a bat house. There's quite a few different styles of bat house, and there's different images online that you can download the plans for it, but some of them aren't very good. And so I can definitely direct you towards some of the better plans that are out there. Bigger is better. A minimum, you want about 1 foot by 2 foot. Also, the chambers are basically, each of those little chambers is where they all crawl up into. And so more chambers is better. A lot of the little bat houses you might just buy at the local store will be a very small diameter and a 1-chamber house. Bats aren't really going to love that. And so increase your chances of getting them to move in. You want a bigger house and you want more chambers. Also, a landing pad is really important. And so these are 2 examples showing like either you need to have kind of scarred, roughed up wood on the back, or you need to put some really sturdy mesh. Because if otherwise they land, they need to be able to crawl up. They can't just fly up in there because they're basically going straight up, and the wood is slippery, they can't climb up. So that's an important feature. If you don't have that on there, they will not be able to use your house. Also, temperature is really the key thing about the house. And so we want to make sure it's not too hot and it's not too cold. The bats will move around in different places of the house depending on the weather. And so that's why the bigger houses are better, because it gives them more places to choose from, hence why they're more likely to use the house. Also, you can paint them different colors. And so general recommendation for Central Florida is that light or medium colors are best. So either a light brown or a medium brown. We wouldn't want to go with like a black house because it would be too hot for them. Also, other critters will sometimes use bat houses, and if other critters are in there, then they will not go in there. The bats will not go in there. Wasps are one of the things that will go in there. Mud daubers will go in there. And so we have found out that if the diameter, if the width of the chamber is less than 3/4 of an inch, then the wasps generally won't go in there. So 3/4 of an inch is generally about a good spacing for the chambers. And also we want to place the house where we avoid predators. So people will often want to place the house on a tree. And the problem with that is hawks and owls love to try and prey on bats, and they will. And so the other predator we have to be concerned about are snakes. And if they are on a tree, a snake can get in there. Also, there's so many branches right around it. It's a great place for hawks and owls to sit and wait for the bats to come out. So we generally do not want it on a tree, and we don't want it near a bunch of branches. Good locations for bat houses: near water is always good. Side of a building can work really well. And also on a pole is actually one of the most ideal places. And some bad places for bat houses: again, don't mount on the trees. Buildings with metal siding are not a good choice because they're going to get very hot. Also, we don't want them near a light. People often, this is a mistake they make by thinking they want it near the light because they see bugs at the light and insects at the light. And so they think the bats want to be by the insects. But we don't want the house by the light, because then again, we're a little bit more subject to predators. And so we actually want to not have it, do not put it on a pole that has a light on the top. That would be a poor choice. They're unlikely to use the house. We also want it at least 12 feet off the ground is kind of the general recommendation. Okay, that is it. I'm sorry if that went long. I don't know what time I started, but these resources that I'm sharing, and I'm happy to put them, share with you afterwards, links to these as well. Bat Conservation International is a organization that's been around for a long time. They are 100% all about bats, and they have the most comprehensive resources that you can find on bat conservation, and they're based in the US. So that website is batcon.org, and they've got a tremendous amount of information. We also have a Florida Bat Working Group, which I am on the board of directors of, and we have a bunch of resources that we've been slowly trying to put on there. And so our website's not quite as good as the bat conservation website, but we're working on it. And also the UF-IFAS extension online resources at the EDIS, ifas.ufl.edu. There's quite a few actually excellent documents on bats in Florida, building bat houses, a lot of the stuff I just talked about, and I can provide you with links to those directly if you want. And I'm also always happy to receive emails and questions from people about bat stuff in Florida. So that is my conclusion, and I'm happy to stay on as long as anyone wants to stay and answer any questions.
Thank you. Great program.
Once I get unmuted here, I can say thank you very much. Folks, I did copy this page with the links, and we'll try to make sure that it gets into the newsletter. So you'll have that available. So let me go through some of the questions here. So the first one came in, what house is the favorite for them? And I think you pretty much answered that. So if the person who asked that has more detailed questions, put something more in the chat box. The next question that came in, is there any research being done about long-term disease in bats, such as cancer or geriatric conditions?
That is an excellent question, and I do not know the answer. I'd have to look into that and get back with you. I'm kind of curious if you have something in mind, or if you've heard of some research that you're thinking of.
This came from Jessica. Go ahead and ask it, Jessica.
No, I didn't have any additional commentary. I just thought that with the species, or with bats being long-lived, that maybe there was any sort of research that was happening for that. So just curious if you knew.
I do not, but that is an excellent question.
All right, the next one that came in, when they're in groups, how do they isolate the sound reflections as their own sound reflection?
That's also a good question. You know, I don't know if we really know that. I mean, there's a lot of people have done studies, you know, with bats in big enclosures inside, and they're recording the calls, and they're putting things in the way and watching them go around. And I mean, they've done a lot of work to understand how echolocation works. But I don't know if we can be in their brains to know what they're hearing versus what their buddy next to them is hearing. I don't know that we have the answer to that. And that's definitely, considering thinking about like how crazy it must be flying around out there when there's, you know, coming out of a roost and coming out of, and you're with, you know, 1,000 of your best friends and you're all calling. I don't even know what they're thinking in their brain. I don't know that we know that. Someday maybe we can talk bat and we can ask them.
When you were talking about how they are out of our hearing range, Ruiz put in this comment, maybe those who could hear the bats did not make it through evolution due to sleep deprivation. So
And that's funny. So you can actually, so there's the bigger bats, and so think of the bonneted bat here in Florida. It's actually quite large bat, and so they actually have lower voices. And you can, if you have good hearing, it depends on, some individuals don't have, of humans don't have as good of a hearing range as others. And if you have good hearing, you can actually hear them. And so it's very faint though. And so, and I know when I was doing bat work out west, like there was a couple of species that you could hear the sound if you had good hearing. And so you'd be out netting and you'd hear them coming, and you'd hear them calling as they go by. And not everyone could hear it. But so there's a few that you can hear. But yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine if we could hear them all. It would be pretty awesome. And also it would be a little bit crazy.
Yeah. Next question, how far north do bats live? As far as the Arctic?
They're up into Canada for sure. And I would say it is probably driven by the source of prey. And I have never been up to the Arctic, but from stories I know from other folks who have done field work up there, there can be some pretty crazy mosquitoes fairly high up into thinking Alaska. So that would be probably dictate the range. Certainly the North Pole, there's no mosquitoes, so we're not going to have bats up there. So I don't know where that line is, but certainly up fairly high, wherever we start to drop off on flying insects.
Okay. Another comment, rather curious about bats' intelligence level, considering how well they adapt to urban environments.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how to gauge their intelligence level. I don't know what our measure of that is, but certainly, I mean, but as far as, I mean, so many animals do amazing things that we can't really explain easily. I mean, these bats are going out, they're flying some of them can fly 30 miles an hour, and they're flying, 100 miles a night and coming back and finding that same roost, and using then migrating away and coming back and using the exact same roost the next year. So, I mean, I don't know if that's intelligence or not, or other mechanisms going on, similar to, bird migration, but yeah, I mean, they're definitely fascinating creatures.
Next question, do fruit-eating bats also use echolocation?
Not that we are aware of, not generally. So they're not using echolocation to find food. They are, so if you look at the Megacropdra bodies, you look at their faces, they're very different, and so they don't have the big ears, they don't have the same structures that are made for calling out and then capturing the information back. So they're primarily using their sight in order to go out in the evening and find they have fruit trees basically that they're heading towards to go forage. So they're using their sight a lot more.
Would they be using scent?
Sure, actually, and I don't know, I would imagine yes. I mean, if I was out foraging around for a ripe mango tree, I'm sure scent could play a part in that.
The next one up, a program I watched said baby bats need to learn to fly from their parents. If a tree gets cut down with nestlings, they won't learn to fly. Is that true?
Well, I mean, my concern, if the tree gets cut down and they're not flying yet, they're going to be probably smashed dead on the ground. I mean,
if someone managed to pick them up and took them to a bat rescue place, would they eventually learn to fly?
I don't know. So I didn't tell you this. My first 3 years after I graduated from my bachelor's, I actually did wildlife rescue. I worked at a wildlife rescue, and we often got bats, but we did not ever have baby bats on their own. I want to say that they would be able to to fly. I don't know that the parents are teaching them anything. I mean, essentially what's happening is when a bat is kind of taking off from flight, I mean, they might be watching their parents and like watching them like, okay, well, I'm going to drop down now. The parents are probably the mother, I should say the mother, there's no father figure at this point. I mean, the mother is flying off and they're trying to follow the mother. I mean, just like a lot of birds do. So, and how bats are, taking off is they're basically dropping. And so they're dropping and then they're catching the air under their wings. And so I would like to think that a baby bat dropping out of a crevice, tree, wherever they're roosting, is going to learn one way or another that if they don't want to drop on the ground, they're going to open their wings and catch the air.
How far do bats travel and do any migrate?
Yes, both. They travel a long way. So it depends on the species. So some in one night, it depends on the species. So some of them can travel 100 miles in a night and go to a foraging location and 100 miles back to their roost. Some of them won't go that far. Some of them will go, 50 feet and fly around the same little neighborhood and go back. As far as seasonally, there's many that will migrate very far. As far as many birds do, going from northern hemispheres down to the tropics and vice versa. So that's actually one of the things I didn't talk about was conflict with wind turbines. And so many of you are probably familiar with so many conflicts with birds and wind turbines, which they've alleviated a lot with the way the turbines are shaped. But there's also a huge conflict with bats, and it's primarily the migrating bats, because where they're migrating is the same wind corridors that they're putting up the wind turbines. And so the bats are actually kind of attracted to them and end up getting hit by them. But yeah, so there's a lot of long distance migrants, and then there's some that are not migrating and they're hibernating instead. So bats in general will either migrate or they hibernate. So it depends on the species. And then in Florida, it's it could be neither. In Florida, because of our weather, and there's availability of food and shelter and water all year round. So we have some species that stay here and may just go into some kind of like short-term torpor. Torpor is kind of a not full hibernation, just like a little bit of a long, slowing the body down, kind of a long nap. And maybe just if we get a cold spell, they'll kind of go into a torpor so they don't need to go out and eat. So we've got it depends on the species, but we can have kind of all three of those.
What should you do if you find a bat on the ground? Is there a bat rescue? I will add that there is at least one place here in Tampa. We asked her and she was not available to be able to give the program this evening. But go ahead, Shelley, with your responses.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer without being in the situation. Most often, I would say the bat doesn't need to be at a rescue. Bats end up on the ground a lot of times, and there's nothing wrong with them. They just ended up on the ground. And often all that they need is to be put up high somewhere and recuperate, and then they'll fly off. And so, although there may be some rescues that take bats, and sometimes there might be a bat that is actually injured that could go to a rescue, potentially ill that could go to a rescue. The flip side of that is I would say most bats that people find, there's actually nothing wrong with them. They got cold and ended up fell on the ground, or they miscalculated something and ended up on a slippery surface and couldn't hang on and ended up on the ground. And once they end up on the ground, it's very hard for them. They cannot fly off the ground. So this is their struggle. They really need to drop to fly. So once they're on the ground, they're a little bit stuck until they can find something to climb up onto. So my first recommendation if someone asked me that would be to try and assist the bat to getting to a location where they could climb up a tree, climb up a brick wall, something that they can grab onto, and then just let them be for a while and see if they fly off eventually. Maybe they won't fly off until evening. If they're still there the next day or like much later, then they may need some assistance. And so there's probably a few people around. I don't have a list of rehabbers, but
there is one at least in this area. The next comment question, I lived in North Florida for a little while. Would darker colors, I'm presuming on the bat boxes, be more acceptable as you move further north?
yes, that would be the correct reasoning. And one of the documents that I should share with you, so I can even put together a whole list of documents if you want and send those to you, actually gives pretty clear recommendations based on latitude and kind of, I think there's a map even of what color to paint your bat house depending on where you're at. So yeah, if you're slightly higher north, you could go with a darker color. The other thing to figure into the equation would be where you're putting it. So there's been a lot of other studies done on direction, north, south, east, or west facing. And really, again, it comes back to temperature. So depending on where you're putting it, if you're putting it on a north facing wall, which might be too cold, you might want a darker color to absorb any light you can. But if you're on a south facing wall and it's in the sun all day, you might want a lighter color. So it would kind of depend, but there are some good references for which color actually to paint it.
Okay. And this also relates to the houses. Why not having a bat house on a tree again, please?
Mostly the problem is predators. So the tree is a place, snakes can crawl up a tree and get into a bat house. The bat house, essentially, when we're putting up something like a bat house, we're essentially trying to make a place for a maternity colony. Single, bats are, when they're singular, when they're not during the breeding season and they're on their own, or males most of the year are on their own, it's just a single bat. And so they're not generally going into a bat house. So when we're putting up a bat house, we're mostly making a habitat for maternity colony. And so since we've got a maternity colony in there, we've got pups in there that can't fly and can't get away from a predator. So that's one reason why we don't want a snake going in there, because they will eat all the pups. And then even if just adults are in there, the problem is if it's on a tree with a lot of branches, we have predators that are owls and hawks will sit on the nearby branches. And it's actually pretty cool to watch if you've ever seen it. They just wait and they'll fly out and just try and nab them when they fly out in the evening.
Okay. Is any work being done on the transmission of viruses from bats to people in the US?
I don't know the answer to that. I admittedly, I don't follow more of the ecology side and not the disease zoonotic side. I mean, very possibly. I'm trying to think even what, most of the work we hear about are in other countries where we have diseases that we know have been documented transmitting straight from a bat to a human. And we haven't really had that in the US. I mean, rabies would be the exception. But other zoonotic diseases that we've gotten from bats directly, I can't think of one in the US.
Is the movement of vampire bats towards Florida related to climate change?
I would say yes. I mean, it's change in weather, warmer, yeah, warmer weather, change in weather patterns.
Which way should a bat house face when you're installing one?
Yeah, so I think I kind of just answered that. There's not necessarily a right answer. It kind of depends on if it's in the shade or not, and the color. So I would probably, if I was just gonna pick one direction, I would probably say you'd want to go south or west. You want there to be some sun. I mean, we think it's really hot here, but it's really not as hot as we think it is. they like to be warm. And so that's also, again, I'll reiterate the reason for having a larger house in size and also with more chambers, because then the bats can kind of self-regulate. So if it's too hot on the very, very surface chamber, they can go to the one that's closer to the tree bowl or vice versa. But I think the recommendation would probably say the warmer side, the warmer direction.
Okay. This is pretty basic, but do you need to know if there are bats in your area before putting out a house? And how do they know to find the house?
Yeah, no, that's actually a great question. So yeah, this is what people always ask because they think they put up a bat house. Usually what happens is they put up the house and then they get impatient because they've been waiting and no one's moved in. And unfortunately, there's no for sure way that we can make them move in. If you've put it in a good spot and it's a house that fits like good recommendations for size and chambers and all of the things that are kind of in good plans, if they need a house, they'll move in. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, people are like, how come they haven't moved in? I was like, I guess they don't need any place to live. They might be just fine where they're at. Similarly, if people actually have bats in their house, like in their attic, and they want to get them to leave, people also erroneously think, I'll just put up a bat house and then they'll just move in there. And then it's like, they're not going to move in there. They're in your house. They like it there. That's why they moved in. And so that's why you need to do the exclusion. But the best thing we can do is put the house, make a good house, follow good plans to build a house, put it in a good location. And honestly, I would say wait a year before you get frustrated and think about moving it. Because once the bats move in, the maternity colony will stay in the same place for basically that 6 months. So timings also can be important. If you're putting it in the middle of the summer, they're not probably moving in the middle. They're not going to move in the middle of the summer. They're not moving their pups, and so you're not going to have anyone move in at that point. Putting it up right at in April when they're right about to have their birth their pups, probably didn't give them enough time to scout it out and find it. And so that's why I say, you might want to, depending on when you put it up, you might need to be patient and wait probably a year before you think, hey, let's move it somewhere else. So it takes time sometimes.
Do you know how exactly to mount a bat house on a pole? Then a baffle could be installed on the pole.
Yeah, and there's actually, I would definitely recommend a baffle. I think that's a great idea. And some of the plans, and I should share these links with you. So there's some of the plans actually will show you how to mount them on the pole. And a really great plan that I've seen out there is actually making 2 houses and mounting them back to back on a pole. So the pole's in the middle and you have 2 houses on each side. And then you can actually even do a metal roof kind of over it. There's all kinds of great plans out there. And I can even that's actually in one of the IFAS documents.
Okay. Where can someone buy a multi-chambered bat house like the one you described?
So I never know where to recommend people buying houses. There's a lot of places that sell houses that aren't very good. And I don't know many places that sell them that are good. The Bat Conservation International website, they might sell them. They have plans on there to build them, and they may sell them as well. And I know there's a couple people in Florida that do sell them. Generally, you're hiring someone to kind of custom make it for you. All the ones I've seen at random kind of garden stores, they're really not very good ones. They're really small and they have 1 chamber, and probably less likely they're going to use it.
Edith put in a note that Nova on PBS had a documentary on bat superpowers, including why bats live so long. So.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. It sounds very interesting. So I just put in the chat that's a link to one of the IFAS publications specifically on bat houses, and it actually shows a picture of what I was just talking about with the two houses, and a lot of all the other information that I've just kind of shared with you. And actually in that document also links to quite a few of the other documents that also talk about bats. Most of those were authored by Holly Ober, who was actually my PhD advisor. And she has now, unfortunately, taken another job in Oregon. So she's not in Florida anymore.
Okay. Enid,
but-
did you want, I saw your hand up. Did you want to add something else?
Oh, I was just going to say, Shelley, that program on the Nova, I think it was 3 weeks ago, September 16th or 15th. They were studying why bats live so long. It was a wonderful program, and you should look it up.
Okay, yeah, I see the link. Thank you.
Okay.
I will. I'll watch it. I can
Okay.
use my PBS
Passport.
account.
Yeah, your passport account. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. And Lucy is responding to that previous question. Wild Birds Unlimited sells 4 and 5 chamber houses, but she's going to have to check that they have a landing pad. So Wild Birds Unlimited is over on Dale Mabry in South Village, sort of behind the Walgreens there on the corner.
That's
So-
great. And hopefully they do. I mean, if they're building a 5-chamber house, I would hope that they know what they're doing, and I hope they put in a landing pad. And so, because if they didn't, you'd really have to take the whole house apart, because it needs to go all the way. It needs to go up well, depends on the house, but it needs to go up quite far, like into the house, so they can kind of get up in there. You might be able to get mesh on there if there's not mesh on, if there's instead. The only word of caution with the mesh is to make sure it's very well fastened and that it's kind of a heavier mesh, because we don't want them to get tangled. So
Okay.
it needs to be kind of sturdy.
Okay. And I do see here that Shelley put the link to the EDIS electronic document information system or something like that, edis.ifasufl. And I will copy this and send it to Sandy to make sure that we try to get that in the newsletter too. And there's also a link to the Nova show in the chat box, anybody who's looking at that. Lucy's going to look tomorrow to see about the landing pads on the bat boxes in her houses, in her store. Otherwise, there are numerous, thank you very much, excellent program, excellent presentation. So at this point, if anybody else has a question that you didn't put in the chat box, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. But I will say, if you're not speaking, please try to keep yourself muted, because otherwise we get a lot of background noise and it gets scratchy. But if you have questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
So I just put another link in the chat. It's just a 1-question survey, basically, if you learned anything today. That's all it asks.
Okay, so
Because, I work in extension, so I need to record those kinds of things.
Yep.
I do appreciate all of the thank yous and positive comments, so that's good for me personally.
So we had over 54 computers on tonight,
Great.
tuned into you. So thank you so much. That was just a spectacular talk and we all enjoyed it. And almost everybody stayed way into the end. So very interested.
Great. I'm so glad that I could share this with you. And again, it's really one of my favorite topics. So I tried to narrow it down, but it was challenging.
It's always great when you're talking about things that you love. Yes. Okay.
Thank
Well,
you so
Fred-
much, Shelley.
All right. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Great
Thank you.
program.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all, everybody,
Bye.
and see you next month.
We're going to be Zooming again.
Don't forget to sign up for the poll polling at Rock Ponds. Anybody that's still on have any final questions or comments before I close the meeting?